So this is actually pretty darn hilarious. So Stefan Molyneux went on basically this weird rant on Twitter. He's made these tweets, and hilariously, he's going into the replies of his tweets. Not only is he retweeting his own tweets that he sent out to get more favorites and retweets, he's retweeting other people who defended him in the replies. This is like the basically the equivalent of giving yourself a blowjob, basically, is what he's doing. He's going, I saw one thing he retweeted that said, "Checkmate Stefan." And it's like, dude, you are really cringy. You have any idea how cringy that is? You're going into and retweeting people, defending you? Oh my goodness. Now, David Pakman did a video on this, actually. I just saw that not too long ago, because he actually got into it with David Pakman first. Now, David Pakman basically called him out and said, just stop tap dancing around it. We did a video covering what he said about Poland and how he's just totally gone insane. The guy has been, the way I see Stefan Molyneux is somebody who just seems like doesn't spend any time on anything other than thinking about politics. And that is a very dangerous thing, okay? There's more to life than politics. You can't just be thinking politics 24/7, or you're going to turn into Stefan. Now, if you know about Stefan, he basically is someone who was a libertarian who has now just gone off the deep end. He was an actual libertarian back in the day, in the original Free Domain Radio days. But once the Trump train came around, he had a change of heart. There are literal contradictory statements from then and now, where he used to defend Muslims, he used to defend immigrants. It's insane. Go check out the video I did on it. I made a video on it. It's insane the difference between then and now. And he took advantage of the Trump train, decided to jump on it, and that's Stefan. That's what Stefan Molyneux has become. And he has recently gone totally off the deep end, 100%. Now, he got into it with David Pakman first. And then he ended up getting into it with a member of the intellectual dark web, Brett Weinstein. Now, it looked like there was no one from the IDW who was down to defend Brett, which I thought was kind of hilarious. But here is how it all started. Let me read this to you guys. Stefan sent this out. He said, "My ancestors were driven out of Africa and struggled to survive winter and hunger. Over thousands of years, they became smarter and wiser through suffering. They made the modern world. Now the Africans say we are privileged and thieves. No suffering made us, no more guilt." So presumably what he's talking about here, and there's not really anything else you could really get at in terms of what he's talking about. I'm assuming he's not even American, by the way. He's in Canada. I don't know if he lives in the U.S. now, but he's Canadian. He's not even American, so it's sort of weird that he would chime in from the perspective of the United States, because when we're talking about white privilege, the concept of white privilege massively exists. It's specifically in the context of the United States of America, not Canada. You're not even in the U.S., so how can you really talk about that, especially in this kind of a way? Now, the specific points that people will bring up, white privilege definitely does exist. Just look at the disparity in arrest for many different things. I've done a video explaining how there is entirely a systemic bias against especially African American people. There's a lot of evidence to show that. For example, people with black sounding names get less callbacks than white people, despite having the same credentials. Some cases even higher credentials. There are African Americans who get stronger and harder sentencing for the exact same control for every single possible measure. Okay, and the disparities in arrest when rates are the same it's insane. It's like 8 times. It's like 8-1. It's insane. When they use them at almost the same rates, it's like an 8-1 difference. And we already know what happens with the cops, okay? We've seen like 2 or 3 African Americans who are the good guys with a gun, who is what the Republicans always talk about we need. Look at what happens to them. Look at what happens. There's massive, not only are there those systemic biases that express themselves through the actual political, structures that we have, specifically the judicial branch and the executive branch, in terms of the cops for the executive branch and the judicial branch, just the courts, massively. But there's also a lot of, implicit bias and subconscious bias that goes on as well. And so it's pretty big. And so that's the context of what I'm assuming the issue he's talking about. So the fact that he's going back to his ancestors just seems really weird. Like, why are you going to your ancestors? And it's entirely irrelevant, your ancestors. It has nothing to do with this conversation that is about white privilege. Now, this guy basically takes credit for his ancestors because he's saying, well, give me credit as a white person. He's not even in the U.S., by the way, so the white privilege thing, in terms of context of the U.S., doesn't even apply to this guy. But let's assume that it did. Why do you get to take credit for what your ancestors did when an African-American person talks about their ancestry and how they were enslaved? You go, oh, well, that wasn't you. You weren't picking cotton. You weren't doing this. You didn't experience that. You're just trying to play victim. But you get to take credit for what your ancestors did? How does that work? So a white guy gets to take credit for what his ancestors did, but a black person can't make a claim about what happened to their ancestors? You got to be consistent. You can't just switch it up like that. You have to decide whether or not ancestry matters and whether or not it could, because you're essentially making a claim. You said no suffering made us. So you're taking credit for what your ancestors did. And by the way, driven out of Africa, what are you implying by that? They surely weren't driven out by any people. That's for sure. We know that for sure. So he's implying that they were driven out by Africans. That's what he's implying. Again, this entire thing is totally irrelevant anyways. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant in the first place, but it's just flawed, super, super flawed. And he says no more guilt, which my understanding of it is, the only understanding possible, is he's trying to reference the so-called white guilt, is what it's known as, called white guilt. It's sort of an attack used against white people who talk about how the system is rigged against minorities and point out facts and actual evidence, which is what they're supposed to be fans of. Now, Brett Weinstein first responded to this. He said, "This is a modern creation myth delivered as if it were an analysis. It is as inaccurate and self-serving the intersectionalist claim that all disparities arise from oppression. Those pushing these stories persuade through flattery. Don't be fooled. Don't take the bait." So Brett Weinstein is basically trying to counter this. And Stefan Molyneux then sends another tweet out later saying, from 800 BC to 1950 AD, 97% of the world's scientific advancements occurred in Europe and North America. 98% of the significant figures were male. No white males, no modern world. Fact. I'm grateful. Are you? End the hate. Aspire to admire, whatever the race. So the problem here again is just the problem of, dude, the context of this is totally different from what the context of talking about the plight that African American people and other minorities have faced in the United States. Okay? And the biggest problem with this is, I think there's even a contesting of the whole 97% thing, because I guess the Arabs came up with algebra and stuff like that. I'm not even going to delve into that. But he says, no white males, no modern world. How do you know that? That's the main problem with this, because that assumes that there would be no modern world without white people, as if it's them specifically who were specifically molded and set up to do this, which just isn't true, and there's nothing characteristic about them that really that makes them distinct to only be able to do that. It's total bogus. And again, what hate are you talking about? You mean like talking about, hundreds of years of enslavement, Jim Crow? Like, what are you talking about? What hate? This guy has put himself in a deluded world. Remember, this is the guy who, whenever a Star Wars movie comes out, he says that it's about the end of the white race. I'm not joking. I am not trolling. Anytime a big-time movie comes out, he tries to take advantage of popular culture and try to morph it into some weird like Jimmy Dore conspiracy of like, oh, this is, the end of the white race. Like, what? What on God's green earth are you talking about? This guy is insane. He's deluded himself. He's lost his mind. And it's just wrong, obviously. Now, then Brett Weinstein responds with a bunch of mocking facts that he says. Like he said, if the cruise ship industry didn't exist, 10 million people per year would drown in U.S. coastal waters. Fact. And he goes on to list quite a bit of those. Next, Lauren Southern chimes in. Yes, Lauren Southern. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux, I believe, are pretty good friends because they were touring the world telling other countries what they should do. And then they were like, oh, we don't like you guys. And then they would like cry and whine about it. So here's what Lauren Southern said. She said, don't take the bait. How about a productive debate and convince people of your position? I'd love to hear this discussion. I'm sure Rubin Report or someone could set it up. This is where it gets interesting because Brett Weinstein is going to go on to basically say, like, no, I'm not down to do it. And this is where you have the intellectual dark web draws the line. Like, no, we're not going to entertain this insanity and this craziness. And they don't like that. Funny enough, even the intellectual dark web has its lines, okay? They have their lines. And I guess Owen Benjamin got kicked out. He's just a total D-bag. But this whole thing of like Lauren Southern trying to nudge them into a debate, it's because when you have that debate, you start to give credence to the insane ideologies of people like Stefan and Lauren. And that's what she's trying to do. And she's pissed off that the intellectual dark web doesn't entertain these ideas. I've seen the thing that she did with Dave Dugan or some guy like that and said, oh, the intellectual dark web would never touch this guy. And it's some way of like, oh, like they're not even really, the IDW. So that's what she's trying to do. She's trying to bait him into it. That's the hilarious part. Then Brett responds to that saying, not interested in debating it. Here's why. Stefan Molyneux is not stupid. He is. By the way, I want to throw that in there. He is stupid. But his stated position is. That suggests his purpose is not an analytical one. The logic is straightforward. His position is nuts. But he might well advance his agenda, and I want no part of that. And then Lauren Southern responds to that saying, if you believe there's a nefarious hidden agenda at play, and his being given a platform may advance it, wouldn't the most responsible thing be to debunk it in the battlefield of ideas? The battlefield of ideas. This is a real phrase being used now. Thanks a lot, Dave Rubin. You've turned terminology into complete cringe. It says, deplatforming and refusing to offer a full counter is a great way to make an idea grow. And then Brett Weinstein responds to this saying, I'm not deplatforming, and I don't think the agenda is particularly hidden. It's standard stuff delivered with an admittedly modern aesthetic. So what's to debunk? That modernity wouldn't have happened without white people? 5 minutes reflection should do it for most people. So, and it looks like that was pretty much the end of it. There might be some more you can go check out on Twitter, I guess, but this is a fight between basically the fringes outside of the intellectual dark web who want to have a space in the intellectual dark web because it grants them this bigger platform to spew their nonsense. And so when you have a debate with someone like Stefan about this dumb modernity garbage that he talks about, you're giving credence to that idea. And there's nothing that they want more than the credence of that idea. That's precisely what they want. It's exactly what they want. That's why Lauren Southern is attempting to nudge him to do a debate with Stefan over on Dave Rubin's Rubin Report. Now, remember we talked about Dave Rubin saying he regretted having Stefan on because of like the creepy stuff that he was talking about, the whole IQ stuff. Stefan is a creepy, really, really creepy guy. Okay? He's a really weird person. And there is a claim to your ancestry when you claim that other people can't claim their ancestry, the whatevers of their ancestry. So you can take all the fruits of your ancestry, but when black people talk about their ancestry being enslaved and subjugated to Jim Crow, they didn't do any of that, so it's irrelevant, their ancestry. But yours is totally relevant, and none of that is relevant in the conversation we're having, where you talk about being driven out of Africa, which implies it was driven out by Africans, which isn't true. It's totally ridiculous. It's totally irrelevant to the conversation of the United States of America and the systemic biases that we factually have, by the way. These are not, feelings. These are facts, and I hate using that phrase, but you already know what I mean. So this is it's interesting. I didn't see any IDW members coming to Brett's defense. I didn't see Dave Rubin, although Dave Rubin has blocked me, so I don't know if he did do anything. But I mean, let me know your thoughts on this stuff. It's pretty interesting. I'm curious to see what's going to happen. I don't think that they're going to entertain these ideas, because I don't think that it is beneficial to the intellectual dark web, because there is a fringe out, believe it or not, outside of the IDW who wants to be part of the IDW, and that's people like Stefan and people like Lauren.